Hey everyone, welcome to M4G Advocacy Media. I'm Mark,
I'm Crystal.
and today we're recording the Journey Series podcast, season 3, episode 7, maybe 8. I'm really not sure. we're kind of we're deep in the we're not deep, but we've just started season 3, and yeah. But anyways, today's guest is Jade Rosenthal, who has had a brain surgery and is going to talk to us all about that in his journey, as well as his chosen career path and his life purpose and all that good stuff. So, hi, Jay.
Hi, Crystal. Hi, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. So there's a lot more to this than the brain surgery. Actually, there were two, but we'll get to that. Why don't we start a little bit earlier? So I was born with 3 rare genetic diseases. Talk about pulling the genetic short straw. So 16p13.11 microdeletion syndrome, narcolepsy, which is technically epigenetic, and von Willebrand disease. I did not fare too well in the genetic lottery, but somehow I'm still here. And really it comes down to nobody's dealt a perfect hand of cards, but in my experience, it really depends on how you play it. Now, for me, the brain surgeries come much later in the story, but I'll start with where we finally started trying to get the diagnoses right. Because in school, I got, of course, quite a bit of help. And fortunately, my parents, they did their best. They brought me to the doctors, the best doctors they could find. Unfortunately, parenting it's not an exact science, and there's a lot of trial and error. Parents make a lot of mistakes, and if you're lucky, it all works out in the end. So for me, I remember I was in college, and in conjunction with the developmental delay that I had, the narcolepsy, and I also had epileptic seizures, were diagnosed both at age 16 within 3 months of each other. Talk about the worst of it. Then other issues started appearing: low white cell counts, an enlarged spleen, fatty liver, a whole host of issues that didn't seem to make sense in isolation. And so the idea came, it came to the idea, my doctor started thinking, maybe this isn't multiple conditions, maybe we're looking at one systemic issue. And me being Jewish, of course, they started looking at my genes. For those who aren't familiar, Jews, particularly those in Eastern Europe, have a very high incidence of a number of rare genetic disorders. As to why that is the case, we don't really know. There has been some speculation. It may have been for natural selection, but we really don't know. And at that point, the prognoses of these types of disorders, none of them are good. And I'd come far enough that I had known that if any of these diagnoses were accurate, then I was going to start losing what I'd earned, and I was going to know it. And that was my worst nightmare. If I manage to get as far as I do, And then I know that I'm losing my capacity for the simplest things like to walk, to talk, to think, to swallow. That is particularly frightening. And eventually one of the disorders that might have been that there were some signs that it might have been the case was Niemann-Pick disease type C, which some refer to as childhood Alzheimer's. Fortunately, it wasn't the case. This was 5 years of going from doctor to doctor, coming up empty. I remember we were doing I was seeing a geneticist named Dr. Diaz. He's still my geneticist, and it's a great guy. And we were searching so far. We'd met the deductible for insurance that year, and it had been a few years since we'd last done a whole exome sequencing, which are all the protein coding areas of the human genome, looking for something. So I said to Dr. Diaz, you know what? It's not going to cost us anymore. It's been a few years. We might have learned something new in the genetic data. You want to do it again? And this was, I think, August or September of, God, I forget the year. Maybe I was 26 at the time or 27. And it took 3 months to run. And I was on my way back from work. I worked in New York City at the time, and at the time I lived with my parents in Westchester, and I was at Grand Central Terminal waiting to get on the train, and I received a call from the genetic counselor, and she said the whole exome results are in. And I assumed it was just going to be another negative. I assumed I was going to be disappointed. Everybody dies of something. I didn't want to be the one to die of nothing.
Right.
And she says, no, it came back positive. Something called 16p13.11 microdeletion syndrome. And she said, can you come in next week? And you would think, first of all, I knew nothing about this at the time. 16, whatever the heck it was. Of course, at that point, it was time for me to double down and figure out exactly what that meant before the appointment. But I wasn't scared. I felt the biggest sigh of relief, because if we finally had a name for what was going on, then potentially we could treat it. If you the enemy you know is a lot more comforting than the enemy you don't, or even the friend that you don't.
Right.
Fear of the unknown is most people have it, and it's understandable.
Yep.
So I go in, and yes, it turns out 16p13.11 microdeletion syndrome is a thing. It's got a very wide spectrum of symptoms. We don't know if the narcolepsy is attributable to it or not. We know that some symptoms are. We don't know what your prognosis is. It could be great. You could get worse. You could get better. It could stay the same. You could develop additional symptoms. We really don't know much about it, and there aren't many people doing research on it. So yes, we have a name, but we raise more questions than answers.
Right.
Never ends. So we continued to treat my symptoms as we had, symptomatically, because it turns out when you don't know much about something, you don't really know how to treat it, and there's no disease-specific treatment. And it just so happened that we found the von Willebrand issue by accident, because along with what we were actually looking for with the whole exome sequencing comes a whole bunch of other data. And you know what? Great. So I found out that I had 3 genetic conditions. Now, the worst symptoms that I experienced and continue to experience were the epileptic seizures, of course, and the uh, narcolepsy, which unfortunately is god awful. Imagine walking around like you haven't slept in 72 hours, and that being your life. Granted, for me, when it's your normal, when it's your default, it's not as bad as it is from the outside looking in.
Right.
It's still not fun. Uh, Unfortunately, no, it's not always like Homer Simpson collapsing on his console at work. No, but does the extreme happen in rare cases? Yes. And is it funny? Yes. Initially, I remember I was upset about The Simpsons making fun of it, but then I realized it starts a conversation, and what better way to start a conversation than with humor?
Right.
That was that truly got it out into the into the general culture, and I didn't have to explain it as much. So, I day to day, the narcolepsy always affected me in the biggest way, but the seizures caused by 16P were the most debilitating when they did happen, because these were violent tonic-clonic seizures. And I remember I was at work in 2017. I was at my office and I had a seizure. I collapsed. I hit my head on the tile floor pretty hard. And then probably hit it harder and harder as I convulsed on this floor for more than 10 minutes. From what I understand, the ambulance got there. They took me to the hospital, and me being the so-called expert that I was at the time, thought, well, I've come to, I'm conscious again. I feel fine. Having spent plenty of time in hospital emergency departments, I don't tend to enjoy staying and waiting for the discharge papers to show up or waiting to be evaluated. So I signed myself out against medical advice. This time, it was one of the biggest mistakes I ever made. In a desperate effort to pretend that everything was just normal, no, I didn't go home. I didn't go rest. I went back to my office. Okay. And my supervisor sees me and says, "Jay, what are you doing there? What are you doing here?" And I'm puzzled, because my intention is to finish my workday. I'm back. I'm out of the hospital. What's the point? And yes, this logic is as bad as it sounds. Because she said to me in the nicest words possible, in a nutshell, "No, you're not coming back to work today. You are marching your rear end home and taking at least a day and bringing back a doctor's note saying that you can come back." And so I did. And as I was walking to the subway, my head started hurting. It was this searing, immense pain I will never forget. Fortunately, my father worked in the city, so I called him and I said, "Meet me at Grand Central. I can't make it home on my own. I can't make it home." And we got on the next train. I didn't make it out of the Bronx. The ambulance had to meet the train and take me off as I was screaming in pain. Took me to another hospital. As I'm screaming in pain, they try to put me on morphine. I refuse. So they roll me in to do a CT scan, but I couldn't sit still for it. They said, we can't figure out what's going on unless you can sit still. So you got to take the morphine. So I did. And I will say, morphine is a hell of a drug because I wasn't screaming anymore and I could sit still. So it's a hell of a drug. So they did the CT scan, and when the doctor came back with the results, all he needed to say was acute subdural hematoma, and I knew that the prognosis wasn't good. I was bleeding into my brain
Oh,
in
goodness.
the subdural layer. And acute subdural hematomas have the highest mortality rate of any traumatic brain injury, 50 to 90%. So the idea that I was going to walk out of that hospital, let alone survive, was not looking too great. I mean, granted, I was relatively young, so I had that going for me, but
Yeah.
I'd already discharged myself from the hospital, from one hospital with a bleed in my brain to go finish my workday. In all honesty, I thought I had done myself in. I thought I'd made my last decision,
Yeah.
which was to go back to work instead of taking care of myself. Fortunately, I knew that it was likely that I wasn't going to live a full life. And so since my teenage years, I had been preparing myself emotionally for an early death. And I had made peace with the life that I'd lived. By some miracle, I pulled out of it. I don't know how. I may never truly understand it, but I did. Problem is, where I was working, keep in mind, the narcolepsy was really debilitating, and it wasn't until a couple of years after this event that I was able to go on a medication that got me to the point where, at least on the narcolepsy front, I could live a close to normal life, reasonably close. And so I was very limited in what I could do. I started out as a per diem milieu therapist working with kids. Then at the time of this hematoma, I was doing supportive housing case management for individuals with mental illness trying to live independently or pseudo-independently in the community, who had also been homeless for a time. But I hadn't found my calling. I had originally intended to go for my PhD in clinical psychology and, actually become a psychoanalyst. And that was going to be my thing. But because of how debilitating the narcolepsy and the seizures in particular were, things didn't go that way. I managed to get my bachelor's degree, and then I went into the workforce.
Right.
Then I came to child welfare. Child Protective Services is always hiring just because there's very high turnover. It's a very stressful environment. Looking at it from a practical standpoint, choosing to do child abuse and neglect investigations, considering my medical conditions, was not the brightest choice. It still had its value, but was it the smartest choice for my health? Probably not. I can only imagine how restrained all 6 of my doctors were in watching me make such a choice. But I did. And in it, I had found my calling. As crazy as it sounds, helping families in crisis. basically knocking on somebody's door when I get a report that the child may have been abused or neglected. Nobody was ever happy to see me. I mean, would you be? Of course not. Of course not.
No.
I mean, I'd gotten yelled at, screamed at. I'd gotten hang up calls at 1 a.m. I'd gotten called every name in the book. I'd gotten threatened with murder. You name it. I'd had it thrown at me. But when I would go into each of these cases with the mindset of, how can I get this family to want to work with me for a reason other than, if you don't work with me, I'll take you to court. Because family is usually high on people's priority lists. They don't want to lose their kids. And these investigations, even if they don't amount to anything, are extremely traumatic in and of themselves. I remember a case that I had of this single mother who was living in a homeless shelter at the time. She had 2 kids. She, two different fathers, both abusive relationships. There was history of domestic violence. There were orders of protection. The mother had intellectual disability. And she was what we referred to, in our own jargon as a frequent flyer, meaning she had come on the radar of child welfare repeatedly. And here I'm bringing up one of the most uncomfortable questions. Can a disabled person raise a child? Now, granted, there's a very wide range there when you consider the spectrum of disability, but what is the minimum that has to be provided, and does someone have the capacity to do that? That is one of the most painful questions that you have to, that needs to be answered. And it's very difficult to do that objectively. Very difficult. I remember this mother was trying her best, but the shelter was not always clean. She, sometimes when there was something more complicated, like navigating the bureaucracies of getting busing from the shelter for the kids to get to school every single day as they needed to be, was not easy for her. And sometimes cooking was not easy for her. And the question becomes, if you're providing services, what do you do? Because the answer can't always be, if the supports fail, then I'm sorry, you can't raise your child. And it can't be that, and you have to look at what standard are you using to measure this? And what alternative can you provide the kids if their mother can't take care of them? And so this was a particularly painful case that I'd investigated. I did end up unsubstantiating it, which was more of a risk to me than anything else. But what I did find was that the government agencies that were supposed to be supporting her, like the Developmental Disabilities Agency, had done nothing in 4 years, which was not a surprise. And sometimes all it takes is just the right skills-based training and the right supports to prop somebody up. And could these kids still fall through the cracks? Yes. But in a free society, you can't, to hold everyone to a perfect standard is to risk implementing tyranny. And this is not a tyrannical society. This is a society where despite my own conditions, I can have kids. Take this back 70 years ago. No, I'm not reproducing. Not going to be allowed. So we have to, this is an important conversation to have. And the truth is that there are a lot of parents with, whether it's mental illness or it's a medical condition, who get called into question in their capacity to be parents by child welfare across the country every single day. And it really is a frightening thing. And if the way that child welfare measures it is based on, are you taking your medication? Can you do everything that that we determine that you need to be doing, the way that you need to be doing it, when sometimes in the disability world you have to think outside the box, that gets to be that's a very frightening thing. And because people who tend to be more disabled also, and this is starting to change as more opportunities come up, but it still is a general rule of thumb, in particular because of the way welfare benefits, in particular Social Security disability, is designed. A lot of people who are on the more severe disabled end of the spectrum tend to be lower income, which makes them more likely to come to the attention of child welfare, which is truly depressing. And I saw this even in my small area where I did investigations. I saw this to be true. But truly, it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be this way, but it is. And when I made all the efforts I could to help families, even with the funding of the government behind me, all this taxpayer funding, and I still felt that it wasn't working. The truth is that when you're talking, when you're talking about child welfare, they don't hold you in any less contempt, or they're not any more efficient or effective. They're not any more competent at what they do than the IRS or the DMV. If you ever tried to renew your driver's license, you ever tried to, have you ever been audited? I mean,
I've never heard a more true statement. They're not any more able to take care of anything
exactly.
reliably.
Unfortunately, in most cases, the government is terrible at doing most of the things that they claim to do. Just god awful. So I had to ask myself, when you're going into one of these helping professions, you're not making seven figures, okay? So if you're not making seven figures, you're probably going in there because you want to help people. You want to do the right thing. Well, if you're not making seven figures and you don't feel like you're actually able to help people, then what exactly are you doing there?
You become addicted to the power.
That's if you stay long enough for that to happen. But what you're saying is true. So I started asking myself that question, and I couldn't find an answer. So I came to an impossible choice. And keep in mind, I was really trying to help people, because you don't go visit a family, get on the subway, or you're going down to the platform and you're on the platform waiting for the train and you have a seizure and you get robbed while you're convulsing, get up, go back to the office and say, and hear from them, we're pulling you out of the field and we're going to assign you to something, something in the office at the, at the same pay. I refused. I refused, and I annoyed my superiors every single day until they finally got sick of hearing from me and sent me back to the field.
Right.
I'm actually particularly proud of that. I fought New York City government on that and I won.
Right.
But the point is, obviously, if I wasn't making a lot of money and I wasn't helping people, what was I doing there? I couldn't do that. So the impossible choice was door number one, I make the best of it in my calling, and I just deal with the circumstances I'm under. The second was I leave my calling entirely. But this was my calling. This is not easy to leave. And door number three was I create what I thought was needed. So this was in 2021. And in I remember earlier that year, I had been talking with my best friend who I've known 18 years now. And I was talking about relationships. I was dating in particular. And, and my income as well. I said, because of, my medical conditions and being a guy too, women, biologically speaking, tend to look for more of a provider, someone who is someone who can be a protector. If you look at the evolutionary biology and the evolutionary psychology of it, independent of social and societal changes. And the truth is that when you are disabled, it does put you at somewhat of a deficit there. And I thought it also limited my earning potential as well, what my professional movement could be. And my friend, who is a serial entrepreneur and fairly successful, just ripped me apart. He ripped me apart for, on both fronts. And he was absolutely right. Yes, what I was saying was technically true, but it was a hill to climb, not a determined outcome.
Mhm.
And I couldn't believe how wrong I was.
Mhm.
But fast forward to August of that year, and I drafted my business plan. I said, why can't we level the playing field? Why can't we help families prepare for and navigate Child Protective Services investigations? There's a lot, most families don't know, it's particularly opaque. The only resources that they really have for help are attorneys. The court-appointed attorneys have so many cases. They don't know what's going on half the time. They're not much help. You want a private attorney, you're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars, and they're usually not going to get involved unless your case ends up going to court. So you're navigating this on your own. So I thought, why can't we do this for cheaper and help families? Why can't we help change the game? And so I drafted my business plan. And at the same time that my business plan, that I finished it, I remember this was August 30th of 2021. I'm meeting with my epileptologist. And she says to me, Jay, your medications aren't controlling your seizures alone.
Oh, my.
We've tried and tried. I think we need to explore surgical options.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I don't like things easy. I really don't. I can't think of any other explanation for why I keep doing this to me. So while I'm setting this up, I'm going for every type of imaging, every test, seeing every doctor to make sure that I qualify. So from blood work to CT scans, MRIs, something called magnetoencephalography, for which I couldn't even do in New York State. I had to go out of state to get it done. Yes, insurance loved that one. So,
But
and then I was back in the epilepsy monitoring unit. I know most of the nurses there. Unfortunately, I've been there enough. So, uh, they narrowed down basically, after a few weeks, the general area of where the seizures might be coming from. And so, of course, this is all during the COVID pandemic, and then Delta is raging, and then Omicron hits in December of 21,
mm,
and I was supposed to go back into the hospital for stereo EEG, which is where they insert a bunch of depth electrodes into your brain and leave them there to find out exactly where your seizures are coming from. And I was in there for almost a month. But unfortunately, in January, they shut down all elective surgeries in New York. So, oops, that's going to be postponed, and you might have to wait till after the COVID pandemic is done. All the while, I'm on leave from, from my job. I'm on medical leave. And finally, they say, okay, in February, you can go. And so I go in and they insert, something like 16 these 16 rods through my skull into my brain with over 100 electrode contacts, searching for where my seizures are coming from. And I'm in there for 30 days for them to get enough data. I have absolutely no privacy. They're watching me 24/7. They always have somebody in the room. And I toss and turn at night. So the dressing on my head kept coming off. So yeah, I always had a lot of people in my room. But that was particularly challenging because you can't go anywhere. You're hooked up, you have this stuff in your brain and you're hooked up to the wall. So I'm on a 30-foot cord. Fortunately, I was able to go to the bathroom by myself. I'm grateful for that. And I did survive it. And I'm proud of myself. And after that, they had to meet and decide what they were going to do. Turns out, the part of the brain that my seizures were coming from is not one that you can remove, not without doing some serious damage. So resecting it was out of the question. So then it came down to, well, what device do we want to stick inside you? And so as I was waiting these weeks for them to meet about it, talk about it, decide, what works best for you? They decided, you know what? We're going to implant something called the RNS system. It's a responsive neurostimulator. It's essentially a pacemaker, but instead of being for your heart, it's for your brain. So in my head, we have the impulse generator now, and we have electrodes, one lying on top of the site where the seizure focus is, and the other actually right inside. And they each have about 6 electrode contacts apiece. So when I was told that they wanted to do this, I said, well, okay. We scheduled the surgery for May 19th of 2022. So here's what I thought. Okay, now, right before my next surgery, I'm gonna quit my job so that I can start my consulting firm, helping families prepare for and navigate Child Protective Services investigations. Granted, I've been doing all the legal paperwork and talking to the service providers that I needed for the equipment that we would need to actually make this work this whole time. And so we had the surgery on the 19th. So I decided, you know what? Here, I'm going to quit my job. I've saved and invested reasonably well. So I'm going to be on Cobra for a while. And I'm going to launch my firm on May 23rd. Okay, keep in mind, the surgery was scheduled for May 19th. So yeah, surgery on Thursday, launch on Monday. That was my first lesson in business. I'll get to that. So the surgery went off without a hitch, and I was fine. I was discharged the next day at about noon, and I went home to recover. Unfortunately, what I didn't anticipate was over the weekend, my head started killing me. And I don't typically get night terrors as an adult, but I had 3 consecutive night terrors, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Yeah. Apparently doing all this crazy stuff all at once is not healthy. You would think I would have known this. This does sound like common sense. Well, I launched on time anyway, but I paid pretty dearly for it. I was not particularly comfortable. And I had to make some lifestyle changes to get things back under control. But the first lesson I learned in business was, if you're going to launch a business, wait at least a week after you've been discharged from the hospital from brain surgery. Wait at least a week.
Probably.
That was the very first lesson I learned. But as I was going through these surgeries, brain surgery sounds like a huge deal, and sometimes it is. But the office coordinator said something to me that I'll never forget, because it sounded so sensational, but it was true. And what she said to me was, it's not like you're having open back surgery. It's just brain surgery. And she was technically true. She was technically correct. Both surgeries that I had, the stereo EEG implant and the RNS implant, were both very low risk. The chance of of moderate to severe side effects was 2%. 2%. There was a 98% chance this would go off without a hitch. Open back surgery is a lot more invasive, a lot more dangerous. The success rate is lower in most cases than it is for the surgeries that I had. You don't think about it that way because you tend to hold the brain in higher esteem than you do your back.
Right.
But sometimes it's just not that bad. So yes, I come on here and you introduce me and you talk about me having brain surgery. And yes, that has a lot of shock value. But the truth is, it's just brain surgery. No big deal. So now I found my calling. I can, with CPS Protect Consulting Services, I can do this from wherever I want. And so one of the things that always made me feel most handicapped was the inability to drive. It means basically 97, 98% of the US, you can't live there unless you can pay for someone to drive you everywhere.
Right.
But you can't really live independently in most of the country. So you're limited in where you can live. Unfortunately, most urban areas with large public transportation infrastructures tend to be more expensive places to live. So you do have to make peace with that. But here, this is something where I don't have to rely on anybody else. And that is, absolutely amazing. I remember when I was going through my diagnostic journey, there was a YouTube video on Niemann-Pick disease type C by a guy named Dr. Mark Patterson. He's a neurologist over at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. And he said on talking about Niemann-Pick type C, he said, you never want to have Niemann-Pick type C, but if you have to have it, there's never been a better time in history to have it because of the opportunities, the clinical trials, the treatments that currently exist and will exist in the near future mean that if you're going to have it at any time in the past 2,000 years or however far you want to go back, there's no better time to have it. And he was absolutely right. And that applies to every single medical condition, and even mental health condition that exists that we know of and don't know of today. There is no better time in history to have it. Look at the opportunities that we have. Sometimes, now, granted, depending on the disability, you're not going to walk just because you work hard. If you're paralyzed from the waist down, it's not going to happen just because you work hard. But when you think outside the box, we have more opportunities today than we ever did to, even if we're not on a level playing field, we have enough ways to compensate, to carve our own path. And a lot of times it depends on our choices. This was something that I tended to encounter when I went to support groups, and I stopped going because what I found is, and we've been moving this way for a while, is so many of us get so caught up in the disability community in the idea that our disability or disabilities are the sum of who we are. That the identification with the group, or the most aggrieved of the group sometimes, is all we are. And the individual in us plays second fiddle. It takes a back seat. The truth is, the desire more for normalcy, it wasn't some social condition that was forced upon me. It was, I want to be able to carve my own path, and I'm more than, I happen to have a medical condition, 3, but it's one part of me. There's a lot more to me. I'm an interesting person. I try to do a lot with my life and make do with what I have, but I am not my disability. I see so many people, because, particularly when it's more debilitating, because you're more limited in what you may be able to do. But in that mindset, it becomes harder to ask, and there was a time where I was stuck in that rut too, but it becomes harder to ask, well, what can I do with the hand I was dealt? And that was the most freeing thing for me, is that there are things that I can do, and there's a lot more that's interesting about me than just I have 3 genetic conditions. Not to say they're not interesting. I mean, that was the worst thing. That was the worst thing I ever heard from my doctors, and I heard it repeatedly. Is this is really interesting, or you're a really interesting case. That is the worst thing you want to hear, because if a doctor calls you interesting, you're either dying or they have no idea what's going on with you, or both.
That is scary. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah. So if a doctor calls you interesting, um, make sure you have some good life insurance and, I don't know, start doing some end of life planning, because
yeah,
that is not usually a good thing. Um, and now for myself, I've created a job where I don't have, and a career that I enjoy, where I am making a difference, where I'm, that where I'm not limited by my medical conditions. And with so much in remote work, and the US being such a business friendly climate too, there is so much opportunity. And when you come from a different perspective, we always ask, you always see in the disability community saying, you don't understand our perspective. You need to understand our perspective. With a different perspective comes unique ideas. Bring those ideas to the table. Don't let everybody else steal those ideas. You really want to share them, with everybody else before you can actually show what you have to offer.
right.
Be selfish. There is, there is so much that that, that this that the disability community has to offer that I often see missed, just because what could be is not emphasized as much as how the accommodations could make it better for me. And that's not to say accommodations are a bad thing. They are a good thing, and we should make we should make our world more accessible. Unfortunately, whether it's politics or the private sector, it doesn't work particularly quickly. So if you want to solve the problem in your lifetime for you, unfortunately, as terrible as it is, relying on society to make those accommodations, again, we should still advocate for them, but relying on society to make those accommodations in a timely manner is never going to be fulfilling.
Yeah.
It's just not. And part of it is I'm a little more disagreeable than some, but I was never willing to accept that. And I think that was truly a huge thing for me. And if I had accepted that, if I hadn't had that conversation with my friend, I don't know where I would be. CPS Protect Consulting Services, the consulting firm I formed, it came from that outside the box thinking. And one of the reasons that I was able to go and do the CPS investigations I did for the time that I did, and had that resilience, was because I was used to the struggles. As terrible as it was to struggle a lot of my life, medically speaking, and have these other issues, it did increase my resilience. And that is a huge asset. When your normal is, comes with its own difficulties, and you have to compensate for that, there is some tenacity that comes with it. There really is. And when you find the opportunity to use it, it is a hell of a tool. It is a hell of a tool. I want to go back to, a little bit though, with child welfare and families, with disabilities, and say, just how overlooked this is. Here's where I would ask you, both of you, what do you think the requirements should be for someone with a disability to raise a child safely? How do
Wow.
how do we do it? Because the thing is, we can, but right now the government and Child Protective Services is struggling to answer that question, and more often than not, they're going to err on the safe side for themselves, which is we're going to overreact in some form, as they do with everyone, not just those with disabilities, rather than rather than any alternative, rather than letting parents be if it's not necessary. So where is that balance?
I
You
think
know, I
so.
have, go ahead.
So, I know Chris will have a lot to say on the subject, so maybe I should go first. Get it out of the way. Um, I think, I mean, I'm not a parent or anything, and but from what you said, it if somehow uh, the system is just so by the book, like everyone has to be this way and do it this way in order for them to be successful parent, when many of us with disabilities have want to do things and can do things, we just do them in different ways that maybe the system doesn't see as acceptable or effective, right? And if they could be more open to that, that might help.
Yeah, sure.
Crystal?
Uh, so, uh, goodness, this can be a really, really long podcast or video. Um, so I've definitely dealt a lot with the uh, judicial system and that kind of thing. And then I also, like you, love the psychology of things and how things work. So you were talking about the power dynamic of in the judicial system. And then later on, you were talking about in the medical profession when they're kind of like, we don't know what's wrong with you. This is interesting. Like the same power dynamic of, oh, I gotta figure this out. I gotta do all these tests. I gotta try out these new drugs and stuff like that. But back to the judicial, yes, of course. No, it's kind of a very delicate situation in that, sure, if the government does not give the disabled person people there's the correct resources to live financially, to survive themselves, how are they supposed to have the resources needed to raise a child?
Yeah, it's truly difficult. I think that you should, as a default, unless it's really the worst case scenario, arrive on the side of the rights of the parents. Unfortunately, if the problem becomes in Child Protective Services, terms like abuse and neglect and minimum standard of care are not particularly well defined. So there's a lot of ambiguity. And the consequences of Child Protective Services unsubstantiating a case and then something happens, are very severe. But if they overreact and you get stuck in the family or juvenile court, uh, which is typically backlogged, and then you're trying to do everything that they're asking you to do, well, Child Protective Services has made its efforts, but so there's really no consequence to them, but then you could be stuck for years. And if that happens, unfortunately, there's a law called the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which says if your child's been in foster care for 12 of the past 15 months, a termination of parental rights has to be pursued. Has to be. This is a federal law. And some states are even more aggressive than that, but that's the minimum. And this creates a system that is, well, from the system standpoint, we're better safe than sorry. This is a case of, where good intentions go awry. And unfortunately, those with disabilities do get tied into it. And some of the clients that I have are disabled, and it really is tragic just how prevalent this is. But there's a big difference between the most expensive thing that we offer to help families prepare for and navigate CPS investigations is $600. Granted, that's a lot, but that's still the most expensive. And when it comes to, actually to child welfare, I think that the most important thing is to have the information as to what exactly they're doing. Because if you don't know what the end game is, or you don't know exactly how they're operating, and since they operate in a very opaque manner, it's very difficult to understand that. So what we do is we actually help take the mask off. And when you have that information and how it applies to you, it's much easier to get through an investigation and likely have a better outcome. And this comes to the activism, and you'll understand this from a disability rights perspective, and I do draw on some of this, is when you don't exactly understand how the politics are playing into it, or what the inner workings are, it's very hard to understand what good reform looks like. So you're running blind to a certain degree. And so I saw this in child welfare a lot. Is the activists were looking for reform, and the reform that they got was exactly what they didn't want, but they thought it was because it looked like it. And therefore, you have to hit somebody where it hurts. So if, for example, foster care and prevention services and all this other stuff are funded by Title IV, the state agencies and municipal agencies are reimbursed by Title IV-E of the Social Security Act. So if more people are not just meeting, but exceeding the minimum standard of care, and less kids are going into foster care, more kids, more families are accepting services from community-based organizations not affiliated with or contracted by Child Protective Services, then that reduces the amount of funding coming in and could force, for the first time, a meaningful conversation on what sensible protection of children might look like. Because protecting children, disabled or not, is virtuous. But if you don't go about it in a way that reflects that virtue, then the act itself is not virtuous. Then the only virtue you have is the idea. And I don't know about you, but to me, that's not good enough. The virtue of the idea needs to be matched by the virtue of the action. And this is actually how my own experience informs what I do today. And being able to use my own experience means that this may be controversial, but there is something to having a harder time. There are some benefits. How they're realized, when you ask, is it worth it? I think that's a hard question to answer. But what I will say is, I love what I'm doing today. I love who I am today. And I wouldn't change anything about my past, because if I did, there's a chance it would change my present.
Right.
Those are great words of wisdom. I mean, Crystal and I feel the same, that that whatever this disability journey that we have to go through is a unique advantage that we have over, I mean, it gives us unique perspectives and the ability to help people in unique ways.
I find that particularly the rare disease community, when there's not enough, when there's no disease specific treatment or something is not understood, sometimes it's because the research isn't there. But if the data that you have as a patient, it doesn't get to the right places, then it's not going to attract the researchers. You run into the issue of, if there's not enough information, the researchers won't be interested. And if there are not enough researchers interested, there's not going to be enough data. So I remember for 16p13.11 microdeletion syndrome, there's one team over there at the Manton Center for Orphan Disease Research at Boston Children's Hospital that has an interest in it. And over the past few years, I have corresponded quite a bit with one of the research coordinators. And when it came to the RNS system, I realized that I had an opportunity. And I thought, what if we could, because the RNS system actually records the brain activity inside me and these seizures. I thought we could actually characterize seizures in a 16p13.11 patient in a naturalistic environment. One of the problems of having seizures in a hospital is all your triggers and everything that affects you in the real world is outside of your hospital room. So it's very hard to replicate what it looks like in the real world in a hospital environment. And so I got on the phone and I did the unthinkable. I said to the research coordinator, I said, have I got the research proposal for you? I actually decided to try and pitch myself as a case study. Now keep in mind, people who are professors and researchers, Boston Children's is affiliated with Harvard. So many of the many of the doctors and nurse practitioners are actually Harvard Medical School professors. And what I said is, if if the team is willing to work with me, I want to provide the data from my device on my seizures for what could be the first characterization of seizures intracranially in 16p13.11 microdeletion syndrome, what they look like in the real world. And I got them talking with my doctors
World is a 1990
to actually do this.
My
Sometimes sometimes the information that you wish you had is only a phone call away. Sometimes you have to be the one to take the initiative, because you're the one with the vested interest. You're the one with the skin in the game, and you have to convince everybody else that they want it too.
That's certainly true. Thank you, Jay, for sharing all that. I know it must been we know it must been tough to get to this point from, where your journey started, and to even see that this was possible.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the thing is, I'm used to having uncomfortable conversations. When after years of knocking on people's doors and essentially without saying a word, sending the message of, "Hi, someone told the government that you're a bad parent, and I'm here to find out why. May I come in?" You know, I'm used to having difficult conversations. So this is easy to do, and it's actually, I want to say, liberating to be able to talk about it freely. Yes, there may be some who judge me for some of my opinions, but that's just, but everybody makes judgments. And the point is, I would hope that if there is something that I say that somebody disagrees with, that if there's something that they do agree with or something that they do find value in, that they take that away without something else that I say discounting the value that they get. And if anyone, who's listening to this podcast, God forbid, they get affected by Child Protective Services, or they want to reduce, they want to prepare for the possibility. They can, they can visit CPS Protect Consulting Services at cpsprotect.com, or give us a call at 844-633-KIDS. I want to see more families stay together and be less afraid, disabled or not.
Right. There are so many things that we want to accomplish with this podcast, and having a wide range of guests come on, is very much what we want to, part of what we want to achieve, and giving people the resources, and not only for the disabled community, but also for the able-bodied people listening. We want them to be open-minded and be able to recognize the things that are not in place, or the things that are, there's a bunch of red tape with the things that are just not right, and things they need to fix, or make it more accessible, or make it more achievable for people to, and we hope, in on so many levels, emotionally, spiritually, whatever people need, that it's going to help people achieve being the best people they can be. And sometimes just because somebody has a disability and they don't think like you, or talk like you, or walk like you, whatever, doesn't mean that they're not amazing at other things, and they can't, and like what you were saying, doesn't mean they can't be a good parent. But if they don't have the right resources from the government, if they're not treated fairly in the judicial system, how does the government expect them to be parents at all?
Do they?
No,
Don't
they
answer
don't.
that.
Well, I'm going to. No, they don't.
Yeah, and it's not just the government. I mean, there are plenty of private resources that also take Medicaid and charities. It's so easy for people to look to the government, but there are, religious organizations, there are community-based nonprofits, there are charities, there are lots of providers that take Medicaid, or or another insurance, or even some people who have medical cost sharing, for example. So I would never want to, and I have seen some of this too, because the government is the biggest provider of some free services and subsidies for those with disabilities. But some people will end up looking only to the government, but there are lots of places that that one can go. One of the great things about this country is that businesses and individuals get a lot of tax deductions for donating to private charities, that and organizations that help other people. And sometimes they provide better quality services too. You never know. So if you're just looking at the government, don't forget to look elsewhere too.
But the problem with that is a lot of times to get those services from those. Okay, so it's kind of complicated because sometimes those companies, those charities are underneath are funded somewhat. Their property, whatever, in some way, they're funded by the government.
That's true
Right.
too. That's
So
true
there's
too.
a lot of red tape to get those services. And you have to wind up telling them your life story and giving them all your personal information.
And
So
also,
you have to be careful.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And it's so important to mention that is, when something is funded by the government, or, you go directly to the government, they want to see how the money is spent. And so they collect an enormous amount of information.
and they also, leave people feeling bad because they have to explain that they're disabled, or that they have to justify why they need certain things, and they have to meet a certain criteria to qualify for things other than just, I need something, so just give it to me. There's got to be a better solution than you have to jump through all these hoops to prove why you need things the way you need them.
When I was working for the government, I did actually see how it got that bad. And the reason is when the government tries to improve something and make it better, what they don't do is get rid of all the redundancies that are left behind when they when they improve things. So you may need to submit the same paperwork 4 different ways, 4 different times, as a result. And maybe you don't need to do that because they already have the information. But because when they create these improvements, they leave all the other requirements in place. They don't just get rid of those. It ends up being a full-time job just trying to submit the paperwork.
Right.
It's absolutely terrible. And that was one of the things is when I was working for Child Protective Services. Let's say I needed to get somebody furniture. Let's say a kid needed a bed, for example. Their bed was falling apart. We could order that bad. But I would have to first get all the paperwork together, justify the need, then submit it. Then my supervisor would need to approve it. Then my manager would need to approve it. Then it would have to go to, 2 or 3 other people who would then submit the order to, once approved, would submit it to the contractor who charged 3 times what the bed was worth. And then maybe 2 to 4 months later, they might get they might get what they needed.
Maybe.
And so, yes, it is the bureaucratic red tape that you have to sift through is absolutely ludicrous. And sometimes it's not even you that has to sift through it. You submit everything and you have to wait for 12 other people to sift through it.
Mhm.
Another issue that maybe you can, I don't know, maybe you have some insight into this is, a lot of these, in order for you to get services or things you need, the government or whoever is approving your need for this thing is relying on doctors' opinions, physiotherapists' opinions, whatever. But they see those people because they went to school and have a certain level of experience as the experts, and they don't see us, the ones with the conditions, as the experts.
This one, oh boy. Here's what I will say to that. There is a big difference between being educated and being intelligent. A very big difference. You can regurgitate what you learned from a textbook. It does not make you intelligent. I have seen
Well,
plenty of people with degrees who have no idea what they're doing. Whether they have their JD and they're an attorney, or they're a doctor and they've got their MD. Okay, just because you have a degree does not mean you are brilliant. So unfortunately, and there are over, I cite the rare disease community more just because I have more familiarity with them. But typically, if the doctor hasn't seen a case like yours since med school, okay, and they have to go and look it up, chances are they're, especially if their if Child Protective Services medical consultant or their mental health consultant doesn't have a lot of understanding there of it, they're not going to understand the nuances. Maybe, for example, there's an atypical presentation. It is a rarer form of the illness. What are known as phenotypes, different clinical presentations. There is sometimes, in a disease, there are a variety of phenotypes. Some are more common and stereotypical, some are less common. And some have never been seen before. But with that, unfortunately, credentialed, the word of someone who is credentialed and employed in that capacity has higher value. And that's where arguments of authority are, when relied on so heavily, can turn into nightmares. Because, in those cases, they're not, those professionals aren't being scrutinized as hard. And so if they're not making an argument of merit because you don't have that authority, your voice gets lost. I am of the caliber in that I tend to have a strong distaste for arguments of authority. Not so much if the argument of authority is made alongside an argument of merit, but if you can't make an argument on its own merits, then your argument of authority has no leg to stand on. Because if you can't tell me why you're right,
Mhm.
other than cite the letters after your name,
Mhm.
then there's no reason to suggest you are.
Right.
And yes, when you didn't have the energy or the capacity maybe to go to school for that long, or maybe you didn't have the money to do that because of whatever deficit, you needed to learn on your own. And maybe you have some knowledge that they don't, but if you're looked down on because you don't have those credentials and not based on what you're saying, yeah, that can get you in hot water pretty quick.
Of course. And it's important to point out that having this conversation with you or any of our other guests, don't say that we don't have gratitude for the things that are in place and the people that are, they do listen and they do try to fix situations, or, those people, of course, yeah. But like we're talking about the whole power dynamic and thinking you're better than me kind of thing, or better than any of us, you know, because we have different experiences, and we don't have the resources. Oh, yeah, well, there's still gratitude there, but it's that becomes not my fault, or you know.
Exactly, exactly. And you two are also, whether it's with this podcast or everything else you're doing with your lives, you're owning your situation. And do you really want to be surrounded by people who all think the same way as you and all have the same experience as you? That would be boring. That would be boring, and you'd never learn anything. It would be an echo chamber. The whole idea is you don't have to be in different situations to have different perspectives either. Part of the human experience is, at least from my vantage point, is talking to people with different perspectives, not just lived experience. It's different opinions. I want to talk to people who disagree with me. I want to talk to people who agree with me too. Typically,
Right.
those are easier conversations, but you know, you don't learn anything new if you're talking about the same things and everybody agrees with you. And that is really the most important thing. I mean, sometimes there are people who are more insecure about talking about, for example, controversial topics. And one of the things that I've done with my doctors is, I cannot walk in there and be the expert. I'm going to the doctor because they are the credentialed expert. But that doesn't mean that I don't have anything to contribute. But you have to be very careful with how you with how you express what you have to say. And so for me, that was always, I can, you know, I can bring my knowledge to the table, but I always have to make sure that I know my place. So I can say, for example, you know, when it comes to something that's informing my treatment, I can say, well, I saw this, this looks like it might be a good avenue to explore, but look, I'm not the expert. I'll defer to you. And that allows me to add something to the conversation and have a dynamic without saying, I want to do this because, I saw this,
Right.
not that I use WebMD, I would cite the research,
Yeah.
if I was doing that. But, you know, when you do that and you're telling the doctor what to do, it, it typically leads to conflict. It does not often go well. So I've found that the way that you frame something can make a huge difference in how people respond to you. If
Mhm.
they don't feel like their position is threatened, they will be more likely to play ball with what you have to say. Granted, it is not easy to thread the needle on that every time. If you try to do that and you expect that it's gonna work, it's gonna be really frustrating. But you can try to find that bridge, and as long as you're doing it in good faith, you tend to have better outcomes on average.
Mhm.
If I, for example, when we got in touch and we were doing the pre-interview discussion to see if we would be a good fit, if I went and said, I am the best, you have to have me on, look at everything I have to offer. If you don't, you're making a mistake. Yeah, this wouldn't be happening. But the conversation went in a very different way. So sometimes it's just there's a small difference between there's a small difference in your actions that results in somebody saying yes to you or somebody saying no.
It's very simple a lot of times, you know, for us to be able to know right away, I guess is they think like they're as passionate about all of this and all the different all the different perspectives that we want to show, so it's obvious. Yeah, thank you very much for your input today and all the conversation and the ideas you've sparked in not only us but our audience as well.
Absolutely, it's been my pleasure. I look forward to listening to it myself and seeing maybe some of the feedback, some of the conversation that does start.
I know.
Thank you very much for sharing your story, Jay.
It's my pleasure.
Actually, before we go here, are there any are there any projects you're working on with CPS Protect or anything you're trying to get going?
Well, we launched recently, last month actually, a subscription blog, which for those who are less likely to, who may have more difficulty affording our core services and paying the several $100s for, for our consultations, we launched a subscription blog, which is as low as $4.99 a month. And we cover every week an article on a CPS related term, a CPS related law, CPS in the news, and we include practical information about how to address it in your life. It's kind of like our core services are, you have a former CPS investigator actually look at your specific circumstance and customize what you need to do for you. But what this blog does is it actually, it's called CPS Knowledge. It's the do-it-yourself version. Now, granted, we post one article a week, so it's still a little small, but we address things like prevention services versus community-based organizations. We address childhood vaccinations and child protective services when you're making those choices, how to deal with allegations of educational neglect and potentially prevent that from happening. Things like what are medical mimics of child abuse, what medications might test as a false positive on a drug screen, and how to what documentation you might need to reduce the risk that the worst case scenario occurs. Because the truth is, there are some people, this information, it needs to be accessible and it needs to be affordable. And while I would love to be able to give it all away for free, to be able to do this full time and be familiar with every single state. And it's not as if for this blog, I would love to use ChatGPT to create these articles, but I can't. I actually have to write all of these by hand because ChatGPT will look at the Child Protective Services websites and say, well, yes, they do this, but what they won't do is read in between the lines and give the practical information that is needed. So we're trying to serve the full spectrum of incomes to do our best, because it's not just, while I do need to make a living, a lot of this comes from, this is my calling and I see this problem and we need to solve it. When a lot of people look at CPS Protect, and I've gotten, some people saying, well, you're a for-profit company. And my response to that is, for-profit and nonprofit are just legal tax structures for the IRS, because I've seen nonprofits, for example, pay their CEOs every spare dollar they have. And this kind of thing happens. What integrity, a nonprofit or a for-profit business has depends on what they're actually doing. And here we've tried to lower the cost. But for example, if you're coming to us and we're storing, we have to store data, we have to document, you don't want that getting out. I don't want to tell you how much cybersecurity costs are to be able to do this right. I have actually sunk my life savings into this to be able to do this right. But again, if it's not easy, it's not usually worth doing. And I am, even if this doesn't last, and if I didn't think it would, I wouldn't still be putting all my time and effort and energy into it. I am proud of what CPS Protect has become so far, because it means that I wasn't willing to accept the status quo and that everything just was what it was. Because real change, it doesn't happen instantly, and you have to start somewhere. And my hope is that what we're doing today is the start of the change that we really need. This is where the term social entrepreneur came from, is people who actually want to solve the major social problems, but also have a business sense to do it. Because if the advocacy is not getting the reform that we need, then we need to come at it from another angle. And this is the angle that I've chosen.
Right. Mark and I have had a lot of the same things you're talking about. And when, you were building CPS Protect, all the challenges that you've dealt with their own disability, it's amazing how you've gotten this far and have done it with all the red tape and all the roadblocks and all the, all the things that tell you you can't do anything. There's a lot more to it, especially, I feel like if you have a hope spiritually, not just emotionally, and you have the drive to do all this stuff. So we are eternally grateful for the people that are supportive, and I know you feel the exact same way when it comes to CBS Protect.
I do. What you have done with this podcast is truly amazing. Giving people a voice who might not otherwise have it. And it is that kind of innovation and that kind of thinking outside the box that leads to meaningful conversations, that leads to meaningful change, that leads to being the change that we want to see in the world. A lot of people talk about the cliche of be the change you want to see in the world.
Right.
How many people do it? It's like those political cartoons where somebody's asking a crowd who wants change and everybody raises their hand. And then he asks another question and says, who wants to change? Everybody's hand goes down.
Mark, anything?
Well, I mean, it's certainly been thank you for all the kind words, and it's certainly been a pleasure to have you here today. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people that are going to get a lot out of this conversation.
I think it's so amazing. Like, we've had so many different guests and conversations, and we can just, with every single one of them, pretty much just be like, oh, we can have a whole nother podcast on that topic and that topic, So these podcasts can go on for hours, but we don't.
They gotta end at some point.
Certainly.
Well, on that note, we have to thank you, Jay, for sharing your story and being so open and just letting people see what disability doesn't have to be the end of the line. Can actually be a advantage and a strength if you have the courage.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay.
Bye.
Take care.